My name is Madison Harper, 32, cybersecurity engineer, the officially invisible daughter of the Harper dynasty. And tonight, the corridor outside the ICU felt colder than the January rain that still clung to my coat. I could taste disinfectant each time the automatic doors sighed open, hear the monitor inside my grandfather's room announce every heartbeat like a sentencing gavel, and see my own reflection, small, pale, fists balled around a keychain, shaped like the enter key, shivering in the chrome wall panel. Through the narrow glass, I watched my father Robert, immaculate in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first laptop, lean over the bed with the rehearsed gravity of a man closing a deal. My mother, Elaine, all designer grief and flawless mascara, dabbed non-existent tears. My brother Alex, evergreen darling of every family photo, hovered by the ventilator flashing his Rolex as though it pulsed life into our frail patriarch. They were supposedly comforting him, yet Sophia, the night nurse, had just barred me with a quick apologetic shake of the head, whispering that the family requested privacy. That privacy reeked of strategy, and each sterile breath I took screamed that somewhere beyond those tubes and beckoning signatures lurked a betrayal custom-made for me, one I was expected to swallow in silence. I exhaled, tasting copper from the sliver of skin I had sliced on the keychain, and wondered how fast love curdles when its value is measured in inheritance. Behind the door, my mother's voice cooed, "Just sign here. Dad, you need rest," and the pen scratched like a rusty hinge slamming shut. I closed my eyes, knowing I was seconds away from being erased, but powerless to stop the ink from drying. The injustice seared hotter because it was a rerun I had streamed my whole life. At 10, I built a crystal radio kit with Grandpa Arthur in his cedar-scented workshop. The moment we tuned a distant jazz station, I sprinted inside, antenna waving like a victory flag, only to have Dad glance up from the Seattle Times long enough to mutter, "Watch the grease on the carpet," before turning back to sports scores. In the same breath, Mom applauded 5-year-old Alex's crayon dinosaur, an unholy smear of neon limbs, and taped it dead center on the stainless steel fridge while praising his abstract talent. Their indifference stung. But the lesson branding my brain was that visible brilliance mattered less than convenient pride, and my light was apparently too inconvenient. Years later, when I begged for $800 to attend a national coding contest, Dad advised a steady government post office job while Mom sighed about tight budgets, then handed Alex the keys to a brand new Mustang convertible worth more than my tuition hopes. Each dismissal shaved another sliver off my confidence until doubt fit like a second skin. And the one man who refused to see me in grayscale was now struggling to breathe alone behind glass. The memory of that jazz riff crackling through the homemade radio flickered, reminding me that signals travel far even when listeners tune them out. And somewhere inside me a rebellious frequency began to hum, demanding to be amplified. Grandpa had always spoken in blueprints and metaphors, teaching me that every fortress begins with a single brick. On my 20th birthday, he slid a folded schematic under my coffee mug, an old habit from his days as Boeing's quiet wonderkind, and tapped a penciled line circling the walls of a castle. "Build these high and strong before you show anyone the treasure," he said, eyes crinkling but stern. Because greed in strangers is predictable, greed in family is lethal. I'd laughed then, thinking his caution charmingly medieval. Yet 15 years later, the castle door was banging behind me, and the enemy carried my last name. Outside the ICU, I felt the ghost of that blueprint unfold, the graphite smudging my fingertips, urging me to shore up defenses I hadn't realized were under siege until it was almost too late. Through the glass, Alex's lips moved with an impatience that belonged in a sales pitch, not a deathbed vigil. And for one dizzy moment, I imagined the contract he recited assets, Stock portfolio. Lakefront estate, while the man who taught me capacitance and courage drifted in and out of morphine dreams. If I stood still any longer, they would seal the vault and write me out of the family ledger. If I barged in, they would call it hysteria and security would haul me away, pinned between impotence and fury. I discovered the thin, quivering seam where resolve forms, and there, like solder cooling into steel, I decided the walls had to rise tonight. I turned away from the window and stumbled down the corridor, nails carving half moons into my palms, lungs burning with the sour mix of antiseptic and betrayal. Outside, Seattle's drizzle had thickened into a punitive rain, needling my scalp as I crossed the parking lot, neon reflected in puddles, smearing the word emergency until it read, emerge. At the edge of the lot, I almost laughed at the cosmic pun, then tasted tears and salt instead, because stepping forward meant diving into a war I hadn't prepared for, and retreating meant surrendering Grandpa's legacy to the people who prized my silence. Halfway to my car, the Mustang memory lunged from the dark chrome. Confetti. Alex revving the engine while Dad clapped, and I felt the old humiliation bloom. Not as a bruise, but as kinetic heat galvanizing bone. I understood, with startling clarity, that invisibility had been my camouflage, not my cage, and if I chose to pivot now, I could weaponize everything they misjudged. Rainwater blurred the world into smeared streaks of street lamp gold. But one line of Grandpa's blueprint burned uncluttered in my mind. Treasure is safest when no one suspects you own it. Suddenly, I knew where to find bricks, how to stack them, and exactly which crack in their armor would let me slip a microphone inside. The idea jolted me so hard, I fumbled my keys, and the tiny enter key clanged against asphalt. Yet even that metallic ping sounded like permission. I picked up the keychain, wiped mud from its plastic grooves, and looked back at the hospital where signatures were still drying. Tonight, I would phone Olivia Grant, the probate lawyer whose reputation for annihilating elder fraud cases was whispered about in startups like a legend. I would call Zoe, my tattooed co-founder who hacked cameras for fun. I would draft an email to Atlas Secure hinting at a legacy tie that could expedite our acquisition talks. And I would return tomorrow, not as the dutiful daughter begging entrance, but as the silent firewall my grandfather trained me to be. Inside that ICU, they believed the last Harper standing guard over Arthur's legacy had just been locked out. Outside, I felt the first course of my invisible battlements click into place. When the automatic doors whooshed shut behind me, cutting off the monitor's relentless beeping, the silence felt less like exile and more like strategy because the battle had officially shifted to terrain where I held every secret advantage, and the echo of my footsteps across the wet asphalt was the starting gun they never heard. Olivia answered on the third ring, her Georgia drawl wrapped around steel wiring, and within 10 minutes, my hallway epiphany became a battle plan. She would draft an emergency petition to freeze any revised estate documents. I would secure proof of undue influence, and Zoe would turn a fountain pen shell into a 4K pinhole camera with encrypted cloud upload. We looped in Nurse Sophia on a covert video call at 2 a.m. The weary kindness in her eyes hardened when she heard the word manipulation, and she agreed to carry the pen clipped inside her scrub pocket during every Harper visit. By dawn, Olivia had filed the petition. Zoe had soldered the camera guts behind a Mont Blanc logo, and I had scheduled a maintenance check of the hospital's guest Wi-Fi, which conveniently granted my laptop silent access to every access point in the ICU wing. All that remained was patience. But patience is flammable when outrage is its oxygen. So each tick of the clock felt like a match head waiting to strike. The first video ping arrived 2 days later while I sat through a corporate VPN audit. And the thumbnail alone, Alex looming over Grandpa's bed, pen poised made my pulse ricochet. I couldn't watch at work. Instead, I fled to the parking garage, hyperventilating between rows of Teslas, and streamed the footage on my phone. Mom's syrup, Dad's baritone, Alex's hissed deadline. The frail protest I knew as the last intact syllable of Grandpa's autonomy, every decibel seared into the upload. When the clip ended, Zoe's autoscript overlay confirmed date, time, and biometric voice IDs. Olivia messaged a single line, admissible, build the rest. The rest meant money, because moral victories rarely sway probate judges without concrete proof of independent success. So that night, I reopened acquisition talks with Atlas Secure and discovered serendipity wearing a tailored suit. CEO Daniel Byrne had interned under Grandpa in the 90s and still kept Arthur Harper's signed slide rule in his office, a detail that turned negotiations from chess into karaoke. We closed on $18 million in cash, and stock options staggered over 3 tranches. The first scheduled to hit my corporate account at 09 Zozo on the morning the will was set to be read, a timing Olivia called poetic and I called insurance. While contracts flew between Seattle and San Jose, life in the Harper penthouse became an Instagram pageant. Elaine filmed renovation walkthroughs set to violin covers of pop songs. Robert boasted to investors about liquidity incoming, and Alex test drove a Porsche Taycan, tagging every story with #legacy secured. I watched their highlight reel hubris from my studio apartment where the ceiling leaked, each boast underwriting the quiet calm crystallizing inside me. Because hubris is loud by design, and justice loves an easy target. Then the phone rang at 3 a.m. Sophia's exhausted whisper told me Grandpa had slipped away in his sleep. Estate now officially in motion. Privacy order lifted. I thanked her, hung up, and sat staring at the solder joint on the Mont Blanc cap, feeling nothing but a vacuum where grief should be. The kind of vacuum that sucks a person forward until momentum substitutes for breath. The funeral was invitation only. I was not invited. I stood beyond the wrought iron gate, rain sliding off a black umbrella, counting the limousines like debt collectors. Atlas's first payment cleared during the eulogy. My phone vibrated with an 11-digit proof that walls had finished curing. And a second later, Zoe texted a waveform icon. The hospital's final log file was ready for download. In the twilight of that cemetery path, with distant hymns muffled by drizzle, I pressed play and at last heard Alex's full sentence. The one clipped in earlier feed signed now, Grandpa. And I promise Madison's little hobby won't end up on the street with her. The street, apparently, was where they thought I lived. The street was where I realized their contempt was my camouflage. And contempt makes people careless enough to leave fingerprints on felonies. The eve of the court hearing found Olivia and me in her office, walls plastered with timelines, audio authenticated. Sophia's affidavit notarized. Atlas CFO ready to testify to my net worth. Daniel Byrne queued as character witness. At midnight, she slid the final exhibit across polished oak, a still frame of Alex, shoving the pen into Grandpa's fist. Time-stamped and watermarked. This, she whispered, tapping the photo, will be the moment the judge hears the gavel before he even lifts it. I drove home under a bruised purple sky, reread Grandpa's blueprint before sleep, and woke hours later to a bank notification echoing 18 million reasons to walk into that courthouse tall. Outside, the city hummed like circuitry preparing to root a surge, and as I buttoned my jacket, I realized the surge was me, primed to light every filament of the lie they had built, ending the story exactly where their arrogance insisted it could never go next. Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. King County Superior Court resembled a film set, rehearsing gravity-polished walnut, flags drooping in artificial stillness. A thin sheen of anticipation stretched over every spectator like cellophane ready to crinkle. I walked the aisle in the inexpensive navy suit I'd worn to every underdog job interview, flanked by Olivia on one side and Zoe ponytail, board skater swagger, encrypted drive and pocket on the other, each step measuring the distance between the invisible daughter narrative and the forensic ledger of 18 million, now beating in my purse like an industrial heart. Up ahead, the Harper row posed for silent cameras, Dad knuckles white around a leather folder, Mom adjusting a pearl brooch that caught every light, but none of her shame, Alex scrolling smugly until our eyes met, and his thumb froze mid-flick. Behind them, a hired PR rep whispered last-second cues about posture and contrition. The bailiff called the estate of Arthur Harper. The gallery hushed, and as the judge emerged, I felt a surreal calm bloom, because in exactly 90 minutes, the same walnut walls would echo with the sound of their empire crashing. And they were still smiling for press flashes that would soon document their ruin. Davies, their attorney, opened with a melodramatic eulogy for familial devotion, then produced the revised will like a magician revealing a single battered dove. Olivia let him finish every sanctimonious syllable. Her expression lacquered neutrality, until he rested his case on the assertion that I lacked financial maturity. She rose, heels crisp on marble, and without preamble, handed the clerk a single-page bank statement updated at 090001, exactly 60 seconds after Atlas's wire hit. The judge read, his eyebrows vaulting, and asked if counsel wished to elaborate. Olivia smiled the way steel flexes before a cut, and replied, "Only enough to correct the record. Your Honor, my client's liquid assets exceed $18 million, rendering any claim of incapacity moot." In the spectator benches, a wave of whispering surged. Mom's mascara cracked at the corners. Alex's phone slid from his hand and spiderwebbed on impact. Yet Davies attempted a half-hearted objection that dissolved when the statement's ABA routing verified. The judge cleared his throat, tapped his gavel once for silence, and invited further evidence, not knowing the next exhibit would detonate the fiction still smoldering in the room. Zoe plugged a tablet into the courtroom monitor, cued the file titled Harper ICU 0417 and pressed play. The audio began innocuous machine beeps, rustle of hospital linens before Dad's voice surfaced, coaxing in low threats, and Mom's confectionery condolences dripped like glucose until Alex's impatient snarl cut through sign now, or this all goes to probate hell, on screen. Sophia's pocket camera captured Grandpa's tremoring fingers forced around the Mont Blanc, the pen tracking a signature that looked more heartbeat than handwriting, each stroke time-stamped and watermarked in legal-grade metadata. A silence followed more violent than any shout. Then a collective inhale swept the gallery, as if oxygen itself tried to escape complicity. The judge leaned forward, asked Nurse Sophia present by subpoena to confirm consent protocols, and she testified that Arthur had explicitly authorized recording while still lucid, a notarized directive now in evidence. Olivia rested our case on Section 11.24. 010, RCWB, undue influence, nullifies testamentary intent, requesting immediate invalidation of the revision and criminal referral. I could feel the architecture of their scheme buckle in real time, like steel under an unexpected thermal load. But one beam still propped the facade, Robert Harper's reputation for impeccable investment ethics. And Marcus Diaz from the SEC was about to swing the sledge. The courtroom doors opened precisely on cue, and Marcus strode in with a sealed file, requesting permission to address the court. Davies objected for irrelevance. The judge overruled, curious. Marcus produced email chains and a ledger of Evergreen Ventures margin calls, outlining how Dad had planned to use Grandpa's estate to plug a $12 million crypto shortfall, a gambit contingent on the will's expedited execution. The timeline aligned to the minute with the pressure recorded in the ICU footage, and the final exhibit displayed Alex's Porsche pre-order receipt dated 2 days before Arthur's death. Annotated paid upon inheritance release. Ripples of disbelief mutated into something harsher: public indignation, filling the air with a charge that smelled like burned wiring. Dad's shoulders caved. Mom began a hiccuping apology no microphone could dignify. And Alex stared at the fractured glass of his phone, as though it showed the shattered future he'd authored. The judge struck the bench 3 times. Voice now granite, the amended will void. The original reinstated. Assets frozen pending distribution. And the entire file forwarded to the prosecutor and SEC for elder abuse and securities fraud. I watched the color drain from 3 faces I had once begged to see me, realizing they finally did, just not through the lens of love, but through the mirror of their own devastation. Court adjourned. Spectators funneled out, buzzing like bees kicked from a hive. Yet the hallway outside remained eerily private when Dad shuffled toward me, eyes bloodshot, lips searching for a script no PR firm had prepared. "Madison, we can resolve this," he whispered. But before he could offer terms, Olivia stepped between us, handing him a card stamped Investigations Unit. A silent reminder, negotiations now belonged to law enforcement. Mom reached for my hand, mascara streaking, muttering that family forgives. I slid free, told her forgiveness is currency earned, not extorted. Alex lingered at the periphery, suit rumpled, ambition evacuated, and managed to hollow. How I answered with Grandpa's words. "One believer outshines 1,000 spectators." His silence said the lesson landed, but time would prove whether it took root. As they were guided toward elevators destined for depositions, Zoe nudged my shoulder, asking if I was okay. I inhaled, tasted the charged air of reclaimed space, and felt something unclench, yet the release carried weight. Because justice secured in court still requires vigilance outside its walls, and the true rebuilding of legacy begins only when the headlines fade. Walking into the crisp afternoon, sunlight glanced off the courthouse glass, scattering reflections like tiny prisms across the plaza. Each shard reminded me of solder cooling on circuit boards, hardening into new pathways. Atlas's press release pinged my phone: deal confirmed. Funds allocated to the Arthur Harper STEM grant for underserved girls, and a text from Nurse Sophia read simply, "He'd be proud." I allowed the words to settle, grounding me, before spotting Nate leaning against a lamppost, 2 coffees in hand, grin modest as always. He lifted a cup in silent salute, an invitation to exhale, and I realized the fight had forged a perimeter strong enough to welcome allies without fear of breach. We crossed the street together, steam curling from cardboard lids. And although the battle was over, the blueprint still called for construction. Because walls were never meant to imprison, but to safeguard what the heart dares to build next. The weeks after the verdict passed in a blur of notarized wires and breaking headlines, yet memory crystallized each moment. The Harper facade shed another tile, Evergreen Ventures trading license suspended, Dad summarily ousted by his own board, Mom's lifestyle channel hemorrhaging sponsors the instant had Harper fraud trended, the penthouse listing flashing price reduced before vanishing into a foreclosure digest. I watched from a coffee-scented co-working loft in Sodo, where Atlas engineers peppered me with questions about quantum-grade key exchange. Every correct answer, another brick in the wall Grandpa had sketched. And every media ping, another reminder that karma, once jump-started, generates its own angular momentum, an observation that felt clinical until midnight one Tuesday when a stranger's number lit my phone and Cousin Grace's tear-thick voice confessed she'd sold my gift bag intel for 70 grand of student debt, a debt I silently erased the next morning, wiring the payoff in full because I refused to let someone else drown, simply to prove I could swim. A quiet mercy I kept secret, even from Zoe, though I mailed Grace a single-line bill. Don't beg, trusting the sentence to haunt her enough to sprout purpose, and knowing the gesture would complicate the clean revenge people assumed I craved, which was exactly why it mattered as the next layer of my fortress. By October, the Atlas-funded Arthur Harper Makerspace opened in a converted Ballard boat shed, smelling of cedar dust and new circuitry. Nate handled drywall between VA therapy shifts. Zoe spray-painted an 0110 mural above the laser cutter bay, and 50 high school girls stepped into a room where soldering smoke curled like incense over possibility. Each of them handed a starter kit engraved with Grandpa's Credo Walls Protect. Skills propel while I stood back, heartbeats surprisingly ragged, because empowering strangers felt more terrifyingly alive than unmasking relatives. A realization that made me text Olivia Justice was the trial. Legacy is the sequel. To which she replied, a gif of court gavels morphing into 3D printers. A metaphor so on-brand that I laughed aloud, unaware local news had set up outside until the reporter asked for a quote, and I answered instinctively, "We're building the future from scraps people overlook." Not mentioning that scraps were exactly what my family once decided I was. A line that would loop on evening broadcasts right before footage of Dad pacing into arraignment, marking the point where audiences stopped seeing me as the cheated heir and started seeing me as the architect of a larger antidote, which rewired the story's power grid in ways even I hadn't projected. The public reckoning of my family unfolded like dominoes, filmed in slow motion, SEC fines exceeding $1.1 million. Robert Harper permanently barred from fiduciary roles. Elaine forced to settle influencer ad fraud claims by liquidating designer handbags on live stream auctions where anonymous viewers typed snake emoji until she killed the feed. Alex allegedly couch-surfing after a venture debt recall seized his condo. I did not gloat, but I didn't intervene either until a 2 a.m. notification displayed a message from his old number 3 words. I finally understand, followed by silence. And because forgiveness is a voltage best metered carefully, I archived it without reply. Yet the timestamp wormed under my skin, making me wonder if collapse had pried open empathy or merely pride's final hatch. A question I shelved but could not delete. Knowing unresolved frequencies have a habit of echoing later when you least expect resonance. Winter crept across Puget Sound, glazing the city in pewter light. And one fog-veiled evening, I unlocked Grandpa's workshop, now a personal lab adjacent to the makerspace, intending to catalog his remaining tools. The musty air carried phantom jazz strains as I flipped the fuse box, revealing the battered oscillator I'd built at 10 still perched on his bench, its copper coil dull but intact. And for the first time since the ICU hallway, I let grief arrive unshielded. A sob kicked loose by gratitude rather than loss. Because the radio had outlived its architect, yet tuned a different signal tonight, a promise that walls need doorways if treasure is meant to inspire, not just survive. A blueprint revision I felt ready to draft just as my phone buzzed with an unknown Seattle area code that made the hairs on my neck rise, forcing me to weigh the comfort of finished chapters against the pull of whatever epilogue insisted on dialing next. The caller's breath fogged the line before a word escaped. Then Alex's voice, thinner, stripped of varnish, asked if the makerspace had room for one more volunteer, because he'd spent 3 months lugging drywall for cash and discovered that building something real calmed the noise he used to drown in champagne. A confession tumbling out so raw, I pictured him shivering on a pay-as-you-go handset outside some 24-hour diner while neon bled into puddles. And I hesitated, hearing Grandpa's warning about inter-family greed war with his insistence that a single believer can resurrect faith. Alex swore he wanted no money, No redemption arc for social media. Only a chance to teach kids what not to do with privilege. His sincerity vibrating like a cracked speaker that still plays the melody. And, against my better judgment, I said the doors were open at dawn, on the condition he entered under the same rule as every student leave ego at the threshold, and pick up the broom before the soldering iron. A deal he accepted with a rasped, "Thank you, sis." That carried the weight of someone finally naming me family after years of misused titles, closing the call on a silence that felt less empty than unprogrammed. Sleep proved impossible, so I sketched schematics until sunrise, designing a modular security badge system for the girls' upcoming robotics meet. But every line slide reminded me I was rewriting blueprints Grandpa never got to review, and the exhilaration mingled with grief until I realized the only way to honor him fully was to let the workshop evolve beyond my stewardship. At 8, I stapled a notice on the corkboard announcing the first Harper Fellowship tuition, mentorship, and a stipend to be awarded by a committee chosen from the very students the grant would support, relinquishing control to those whose futures demanded louder amplification, an act that terrified me precisely because it was irreversible. Yet the pen in my hand felt lighter than the Mont Blanc that once coerced a dying signature, and the contrast solidified the lesson that tools themselves are neutral. Intent dictates whether they become keys or knives. A truth I intended to test the moment Alex crossed the threshold. When he arrived, hoodie clinging damp from morning drizzle, the girls glanced up from circuit diagrams, but returned to work after I greeted him with a nod. The makerspace culture instinctively enforcing respect through productivity rather than hierarchy. And I watched him sweep sawdust in contemplative rhythm, shoulders loosening each time a student asked where the extra hex bits were stored until, midway through the shift, a sophomore named Lena challenged him to a solder relay race, and he laughed genuine, irrepressible, the sound of rust cracking off a bell before losing by a millisecond, and applauding her victory so enthusiastically the entire room erupted. The moment so incongruously pure, I snapped a photo that captured not redemption, but possibility, planning to archive it privately as evidence that even broken threads can weave tensile fabric when integrated thoughtfully. Though part of me wondered how long the weave would hold. Building walls, I realized, isn't about exclusion, but about choosing which gates must remain guarded and which deserve new hinges. An architectural nuance Grandpa never wrote down because some equations were meant to solve alone. That night, while locking up, I heard the faint hiss of the old radio powering on by itself, jazz murmuring through static as if Arthur Harper were testing the acoustics of legacy. And I stood in the doorway listening until the refrain faded into the hum of 3D printers cooling. Aware that Chapter 1 of this family reckoning had concluded, but sequels rarely ask permission to begin, especially when forgiveness, like voltage, continues to seek the shortest path to ground. Story 2. I never intended to become the family ATM. But when my cousin Darren and his wife hit rough waters newborn, mountain of medical bills, and Darren suddenly jobless, I stepped in without hesitation. I told them not to worry about rent that month. 1 month turned into 3, then 6, and before I knew it I was covering their rent, utilities, groceries, even internet and phone. I made decent money as a UX designer in Austin's booming tech scene. No kids, no spouse, just my dog and a mortgage. It felt good finally. I was useful. Growing up, I'd been the quiet one at family reunions while Darren played the golden boy. Helping him felt like earning a seat at the table I'd always watched from the corner. Then came the Tuesday call. I was drafting wireframes when Darren rang for more cash this time for an outrageous heating bill. I promised the transfer later that night, hung up, and turned back to work. A minute later, I realized the line was still open. At first, I reached to end the call, but then laughter Darren's easy guffaw, his wife's muffled chuckle, his sister's teasing tone cut through the speaker. They joked that I thought paying their bills made me important, laughed at how desperate I seemed for family approval, how I'd always been overlooked. My chest clenched, but I didn't hang up until the punchline landed. Betrayal isn't a hot burst, it's a slow ice tide pulling you out to sea. When I finally ended the call, I didn't rage or cry. I sat, stunned, listening to my own ragged breathing. In that accidental eavesdropping, I saw years of polite gratitude that was really tolerance. Every kindness twisted into a joke. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't even answer Darren's texts saying, "Thanks again," or "Appreciate you." Man. Instead, I planned. Rent day approached, and usually I'd autopay without a thought. This time, I simply did nothing, waiting to see how long they'd panic when the money never arrived. Day 1 passed with silence. Day 2 brought a polite reminder text. Day 3, a pleading voicemail. Day 5, his wife's worried message about the landlord's notice. I still held my silence, recalling how those I'd helped had joked behind my back as if I'd never find out. The real sting wasn't money lost. It was realizing I'd been a prop in their comfort. Not family. I refused to explain. I let my absence speak volumes. By week 2, the pressure spread. Aunt Mary called, feigning concern. "Have you talked to Darren? He's under stress." I thanked her, said they'd figure it out, and hung up. The landlord eventually reached out to me co-signer on their lease, inquiring if rent would be paid. I told him flatly I was no longer involved, and that any further discussion belonged with Darren and his wife. The silence that followed that call echoed louder than any argument. Their world unraveled swiftly. Darren left frantic texts. His wife posted cryptic Facebook statuses about people disappearing when you need them most. My phone stayed quiet. Then came the eviction notice, a final 10-day deadline. I watched the documents before me, the same papers I'd once funded month after month, now a hollow monument to my decision. No more stonewalling. This was boundary setting at its finest. On the morning of their lockout, I passed their darkened duplex on my walk windows boarded, boxes on the porch. Neighbors whispered, glancing at me as I walked by. I didn't gloat. I merely breathed in the freedom from obligation. That night, I made myself a simple dinner, lit a candle, and sat alone at my table, not out of loneliness, but by choice. The peace was my reward. They never apologized. They didn't ask for mercy. They didn't deserve it. In the emptiness they left behind, I found my own worth no longer defined by what I gave, but by what I would no longer tolerate. And in that silence, I finally heard my own voice, clear and unbroken, ready for the next chapter. By the end of that first week of silence, the texts had piled up unanswered, and the void I'd created felt oddly powerful. Darren's polite reminders turned into pleading voicemails. Chloe's emojis shifted from grateful hearts to frantic question marks. Then Aunt Mary called never one to meddle with money. She feigned casual concern about family harmony, but slipped in that Darren was fielding panicked calls from the landlord. My chest tightened as I listened, pretending calm, and told her firmly that I was no longer involved. When I hung up, the hush in my apartment felt like a drumbeat charging the air. And I knew this boundary had to be absolute. I wouldn't just vanish. I would make sure they felt the gap I left. That afternoon, I reached out to Karen Blake, the real estate attorney my neighbor recommended. Karen's voice over the speakerphone was cool precision. File a temporary restraining order against any further rent withdrawals. Notify the eviction court, and send written notice to both Darren and Chloe that you're rescinding your co-signer status. She warned me that landlords often drag co-signers into late fee disputes. so every step had to be documented. I printed her letter, scanned the eviction notices, and lined up screenshots of my bank transfers for evidence. As I stapled the envelopes, the stack looked like battle plan's legal artillery ready to lay siege to their entitlement, and I felt an unexpected surge of clarity. That evening, I met Jordan Kim, my high school friend turned locksmith, at his tiny shop on South Congress. The fluorescent bulbs hummed as he handed me a set of tamper-proof keypad locks and steel slide bolts. I demonstrated installing one on my own front door. Each click and bolt sliding into place sounded like a seal on my resolve. Jordan watched, eyebrows raised, then gave me an affirming nod. "These'll keep anyone out who doesn't have your code." As I tested the keypad, the weight of possibility pressed down. I wasn't building walls to keep loved ones out, but to protect the respect I'd spent a lifetime seeking. No sooner had I wired Jordan the payment than a neighbor, Emily Garcia, knocked at my door. She'd heard my front door thumping in the night and guessed I was changing locks. Her concern wasn't curiosity, it was admiration. She'd seen Chloe and Darren's Airbnb guests crowd the block, late-night noise and code violations running rampant. Emily's tip led me to file the formal complaint with code enforcement, prompting Officer Maria Sanchez to show up the next morning with a citation: unauthorized short-term rentals. Address 472 South 4th Street. Violation code 12.4.3. Fine $1,000 per day. I watched the officer take notes under my vigilant gaze. A legal storm gathering over the duplex I'd once propped up with my paycheck, and I felt satisfaction tinged with sadness as I realized they'd engineered their own reckoning. That afternoon, I sat in my living room, walls now fortified with fresh locks, and typed the final email to the landlord's office. I am no longer co-signer. All future lease and fee inquiries must be directed to Darren Reynolds. Sending it felt like exhaling after a breath held too long. Then, my phone buzzed a calendar invite titled Hearing Code Enforcement vs. Thompson Rental, scheduled 2 weeks out at City Hall. I opened my notes, bank statements, eviction notices, Karen's letter, Emily's witness statement, and laid them in neat piles on my desk. The silence that settled was not empty but charged, preparing me for the courtroom where I would prove that kindness without boundaries becomes a weapon turned against the giver. And I knew the next chapter would decide not just their fate, but mine. With 7 days to go, I found myself holed up in my home office, the City Hall hearing notice taped above my desk like a gauntlet thrown at my feet. I'd compiled binders of bank statements, eviction notices, Karen Blake's restraining order draft, and Emily Garcia's neighbor testimony, each page a stitch in the case I'd woven against the Thompsons. My fingers trembled slightly as I flipped through the printed chat logs, Darren's jokes at my expense, and I realized how far family help had warped into exploitation. The stack under my arm felt less like paper and more like a loaded weapon, primed to fire my truth across the courtroom floor. And I knew I would have only one chance to wield it effectively. That afternoon, I met Karen at her sleek downtown office, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing my jitters. She paced around the mahogany table, quizzing me on every detail. What if their attorney argues undue haste? How will you respond when they claim the eviction notice was the landlord's fault, until I could anticipate the cross-examination like lines in my own head? By the end, she handed me a folder of procedural motions and deadlines code citations, notice of hearing protocols, chain of custody forms for digital evidence. As I slipped it into my binder, I felt the raw edge of uncertainty if I misstate a date or omit a notarization. All my work could unravel with one pointed objection. That evening, Aunt Grace rumbled up in her Subaru, a concerned frown creasing her brow, over lukewarm coffee in my kitchen. She revealed she'd tracked Chloe's secret Airbnb under a fake LLC earnings funneled through a secondary account Darren thought I'd never uncover. She slid a USB drive across the table, with transaction histories time-stamped at 3 a.m. when I was asleep. I stared at the gleaming metal. Heart thudding, this new twist could solidify the narrative of bad faith, but only if I introduced it flawlessly. One misstep and I'd look vindictive, not justified, and that would hand my family the moral high ground. The next morning, Officer Maria Sanchez arrived to collect my formal complaint under Code Enforcement Case 2025 AUS 472. She recorded my witness statement in her notepad, eyes solemn as I recounted the frenzied guests, the lockouts, the midnight check-ins at our shared wall. Then she photographed the tamper-proof seals I'd affixed to the breaker box and the new keypad locks Jordan had installed. As she drove away with my file, I felt the weight of a legal storm gathering over the duplex, a storm I'd summoned not out of spite, but to reclaim the respect they'd so casually discarded. On hearing day, rain slicked the sidewalks outside the austere annex of Austin's municipal courts. Inside, the corridors smelled of institutional carpet and stale coffee. I walked the stretch from security to room 3B with Karen at my side, clutching the binder like a lifeline. Across the aisle sat Darren and Chloe, their attorney's elbow tapping a restless rhythm. When the clerk announced our case, my pulse surged, as if the fluorescent glare had turned my heart into a drum. The room contracted into a pinpoint of focus code violations, eviction filings, deed amendments, the script I'd rehearsed over dinner plates, and late-night emails. Mr. Patel from the landlord's office presented first, his gravelly voice detailing months of unpaid rent and the landlord's futile pleas. Then, Chloe's attorney launched into a rehearsed tirade about Jeremiah's unreasonable accusations and malicious withdrawal of family support. My stomach knotted, but I reminded myself of Clara's dossier and Emily's affidavit. And when I rose to present, I felt each step ground me in purpose. I laid out the deed amendment, the Airbnb payouts on the USB drive, and the bank records, each document a brick in my case. As I clicked to the final chat screenshot, Darren's mocking laughter frozen in time, I sensed the courtroom inhale, waiting for the judge's reaction. And that moment decided everything. The judge leaned forward, steepling fingers beneath his chin, and asked a single, precise question, Mr. Reynolds. Can you confirm that these funds were used without your consent? His gaze sharpened the space between us into a razor's edge. I steadied my breath, feeling the old crack of betrayal like ice against my ribs, and answered, Your Honor, not only were they used without consent, but they were celebrated behind my back as if generosity were a punchline. The words landed with quiet force, and as the judge scribbled into his notebook, I knew the scale had shifted irrevocably, yet the final verdict still lay ahead, waiting beyond that pen stroke. Early that morning, before the sky had even begun to lighten, I was hunched over my laptop in the muted glow of my home office, scrolling through Erica's draft of the temporary restraining order. The legal jargon felt less like words on a page and more like an armor I was forging for myself, heavy, unyielding, necessary. By 8:15 a.m. Mendes, I had fired off emails to Airbnb, VRBO, and the city's short-term rental registry, remove all listings for 472 South 4th immediately. Failure to comply will result in legal action. A flurry of automated acknowledgments pinged my inbox. Then silence settled in a quiet so profound, it felt like a chamber waiting to echo my next move. My phone buzzed once, a voicemail from Tyler. Urgent and tentative, Maddie. We need to talk, this has gone too far. I didn't rush to listen. Instead, I let the echo of my own heartbeat fill the room, knowing that I needed every second to steel myself for what was coming. By late morning, Officer Maria Sanchez arrived at my door, a tall woman in a crisp code enforcement uniform, her notepad out even before she stepped onto the porch. She handed me a yellow slip hearing scheduled in 12 days at City Hall. Fines of $1,000 per unauthorized booking. The paper trembled slightly in my hand, but I kept my voice level as I thanked her and watched her retreat into the mist. Inside, I pinned the notice to my kitchen bulletin board above the diagram of the duplex, new keypad locks gleaming beneath it like steadfast sentinels. Just then, the doorbell rang. My mother, Helen, and Tyler, faces pinched with rain and panic, standing on my stoop in soaked jackets and guilt. They begged for more time on rent, pleaded about the utilities cut off, eyes wide as if I'd turned off their oxygen. I listened, each word tightening the glacis around my resolve, then replied quietly, "I'm enforcing the terms we agreed to. You have until Friday to vacate." Their shoulders slumped, the rain pattering a solemn applause, and I felt the tether snap finally free of the weight I'd carried for so long. That afternoon, I slipped into Elliot Kim's cramped hardware shop on South Congress. The air smelled of motor oil and steel filings as I loaded a basket with tamper-proof seals, slide bolt locks, and heavy-duty door chains. Elliot, a friend since high school, watched me select each piece with a knowing nod. "These'll hold," he said. Wiping grease from his hands, I practiced the slide bolt on the demo door, each metallic click resonating like a vow. When I handed over the cash, his grin was one of solidarity. No more uninvited guests. Walking back through Austin's drizzle, my pockets felt heavy not with coins, but with the promise of boundaries I would never again regret setting. Each lock I'd install would be another chapter in my self-respect, another wall built to protect the person behind it. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across my kitchen floor, Aunt Clara knocked softly on my door. She held a slim USB drive like a lifeline, worry etched into her features. Over takeout pizza at my dining table. She confessed she'd unearthed financial records showing Chloe and Darren's Airbnb earnings funneled through a Shell LLC transactions time-stamped in the dead of night, precisely when I thought I was their unsung benefactor. Clara's voice shook as she slid the drive across the table. "This ties it all together, the betrayal, the concealed profits, the mocking laughter." I stared at the device, pulse hammering, realizing that introducing this evidence could seal their undoing, but only if I wielded it perfectly. Outside, the cicadas thrummed, the night air thick with anticipation. I tapped out a message to Clara and Erica meeting at La Trattoria. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Bring everything." That single line swung wide the door to the next Act 1. I was both terrified and determined to face. Clara and I met Erica at La Trattoria before the lunch rush. Patio tables damp with spring drizzle. Clara slid me a USB drive containing Chloe and Ethan's hidden Airbnb earnings late-night payouts, funneled through a Shell LLC, while Erica spread out binders of eviction notices, bank statements, and Officer Sanchez's citations. Erica's voice was all precision as she quizzed us. When the judge asks about motive, "You'll say you stopped funding them only after discovering their secret profits. If they argue you prematurely withdrew support, point to the audio transcripts of their mocking laughter." I ran through my lines under my breath, feeling gratitude and dread knot together in my chest. When our coffees arrived, the steam blurred my vision, and I realized this gathering wasn't just strategy. It was the calm before a storm I had summoned. That afternoon, City Hall's annex loomed gray as I approached room 3B, clutching the binders like shields. Inside, Darren and Chloe sat with their attorney. Their confident smiles faded under the fluorescent glare. The clerk called our case, and Mr. Patel, the landlord's rep, stepped forward first, detailing months of unpaid rent and breach of lease. Then Erica presented the Airbnb payouts from Clara's drive, spreadsheets of clandestine bookings, and the screenshots of our family group chat, Darren's mocking lines frozen in digital ink. When she finally handed the judge the chat log transcript and played the clipped audio of their laughter, the courtroom grew still, as if time itself was holding its breath. and I felt every eye turn my way, waiting for the verdict that would either sink or seal my resolve. The judge's gavel cracked the hush, and his voice declared all evidence admissible. The temporary restraining order would stand, the fines would accrue daily, and the duplex would be vacated within 30 days. He dismissed the Thompsons' motion to reinstate my co-signer status and ordered their Airbnb account suspended for code violations. Relief washed over me in cold waves. But beneath it lay a bittersweet ache I'd defended more than bricks and mortar. I'd reclaimed my dignity. Clara hugged me as tears shimmered on her lashes. Erica nodded, her professional mask slipping into a rare, warm smile. Beyond the courtroom doors, rain had begun again, each drop a punctuation on the chapter I closed. That evening, I unlocked the darkened duplex with Jordan's tamper-proof keys. Stepping inside the shell of a home that once housed my generosity, each room was barren boxes stacked, dust motes dancing in the lone bulb's beam, yet the silence felt like a blank page. I moved from room to room, sliding the new deadbolts into place, listening to the satisfying clicks that echoed my resolve. In the kitchen, I found one of Chloe's lipstick-stained coffee mugs, the last trace of their tenancy, and I left it for the recycler. A quiet monument to boundaries redrawn. I didn't gloat. I simply walked back to my car under the street lamp's glow, the duplex sealed behind me like a promise kept. Back in my apartment, I brewed a strong cup of tea and spread the judge's order, the eviction papers, and Clara's USB drive across the dining table. The cicadas hummed outside my window as I drafted the next plan, renovating the duplex into a co-living space for young women in tech. A bridge from my own struggle to a community I believed in. As I typed the mission statement, "From boundaries come opportunity," my heart lightened with purpose. Outside, the city lights of Austin shimmered on wet pavement, and I knew the real work was only beginning. The walls I built to protect myself would now become foundations for others, and that promise carried me into the night. Ready for what came next. Story 3. Evie Carter stepped into the glass house half an hour before her reservation, heart pounding beneath the lapels of her navy blazer, the polished marble floors echoing every deliberate click of her heels. As senior project manager at Nimbus Cloud, she'd spent 5 years mastering the art of keeping calm under pressure. But walking past the valet stand where her name wasn't on the list felt like a betrayal of her own dignity. The hostess checked her tablet, then told her to wait. Brow furrowed. After 10 minutes, she was led to a slender stool near the coat check. A single takeout box placed before her, as if on a charity docket. Inside, cold teriyaki chicken and rice sat under fluorescent lights, a pathetic simulacrum of the 4-course tasting menu her mother and sister would enjoy. Beyond the half-wall, the din of celebration swelled Lauren Carter's laughter, tinkling like crystal as she toasted her son Ethan's big promotion. The table arranged with crystal flutes, gold-rimmed plates, even personalized place cards for every guest except Evie. She hadn't been included in the group text, only beckoned as an afterthought. And now her sister's team of influencers and aunts circled Ethan like court jesters around a prince. Evie lifted the plastic fork, stabbed a bite with the precision of a surgeon, and tasted humiliation richer than any sauce. She reminded herself she'd bankrolled their mortgage and medical bills for 3 years, tolerated their casual demands and endless thankless favors, and yet all her sacrifices fit neatly into that to-go box. As she chewed, she scrolled through Tiffany's tagged photo, Karen draped in daughterly pride, Dylan's fiancé, grinning beside a neon jet ski. The caption, "Seats reserved for real family." In that still hallway, the world shrank to the bite in her mouth and the steel edge of betrayal sliding down her spine, and she realized this evening was never about her nephew. It was about her place in their lives. Minutes later, As the restaurant staff cleared away the last of the desserts, Evie saw the waiter approach leather folder in hand, shoulders slumped in practiced sympathy, and kneel beside her stool. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, voice courteous, "your sister added you as a fallback payer on this booking. The total comes to $2,981.46. His words landed like a judge's gavel. The sterile scent of roasted duck and white wine curdled in her nostrils. Evie rose, folding the folder into her hand with deliberate slowness and carrying it to the alcove where her family's shadows danced across linen tablecloths. Lauren's wide smile faltered. Greg glanced up from his phone. Her mother's polite nod trembled at the corners. Evie stopped at the head of the table, met Lauren's eyes, and placed the bill on the polished wood. "I don't pay for strangers," she said, voice steady as an oath. No tearful monologue, no dramatic exit, just a quiet reckoning that reverberated through the room. As she turned and walked out past the coat check, past the hushed murmurs, she felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders, replaced by the icy clarity that this was only the beginning. The dawn after my silent declaration arrived with a storm of notifications, 81 missed calls, plus half a dozen frantic voicemails from Mom, Dad, and Dylan whirring together like broken record players. Karen's voice cracked through with tears. "Evie, what happened?" Frank's trembled with disbelief. "This can't be real." Dylan barked. "You disabled the mortgage. Why would you do that?" I stood in my kitchen, the countertop still littered with mortgage statements and faded sticky notes, every unpaid bill a monument to my years of unpaid labor, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I could choose not to answer. Instead, I sipped my black coffee, shoulders relaxing as the sun climbed, and drafted a terse email to my boss, "Family emergency need today off." The click of send echoed louder than any argument I might have had with them. By mid-morning, anxiety gnawed at me in waves of doubt. Had I gone too far, I traded my pajamas for the tailored suit I'd bought for this promotion. Determined to reclaim some normalcy, Nimbus Cloud's lobby greeted me with its familiar hum of servers and coffee machines. Natalie Brooks, my confidant and fellow late-night warrior, slipped me a knowing look and quietly asked, "Heard about Round Rock, everything okay?" I offered a tight smile and replied, "Taking a personal day," slipping past her into my office. On my desk lay a foreclosure notice emailed by Riley Nguyen. The Carter house listed for auction in 30 days, a final countdown on the home I'd propped up while they toasted my nephew's future, facing that inevitable deadline. I felt the elastic of my resolve snap taut. Either rescue the house on my terms, or let it collapse under its own weight. That afternoon, I arranged lunch with Marcus Lee, my ex-boyfriend turned real estate consultant, whose knack for numbers once kept his startup afloat. Over charred avocado toast in a sunlit cafe, he laid out the brutal calculus the house's equity was underwater. A sale would barely cover liens, and foreclosure would cripple my parents' credit for a decade. He paused, eyes soft with regret, then added, "You could buy it at the auction yourself, protect them. Maybe even flip it later. But the cash call would drain your savings." I felt the cold ledger of costs against my pampered life in the city: rent, student loans, the auto pay I'd fought to maintain, and wondered if pulling out my own wallet was an act of love, or the last strand tying me to a family that never thanked me. As I stared down at the half-eaten toast, its charred edges mirrored my own uncertainty. Could I fund this rescue? Or was it time to salvage something else entirely? My phone buzzed with a text from Tiffany Carter, offering superficial concern tinged with curiosity. Saw the foreclosure notice online. Everything okay? Her words felt like a ripple in stagnant water, reminding me that my choices wasn't just a personal reckoning, but would soon become family legend. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of their silent expectations settle, and felt the first real flicker of freedom ignite a freedom that might require letting the house fall, or letting the family learn what happens when you stop bailing them out. Either way, the next move was mine alone. Letters began slipping under my apartment door like hesitant truth bombs the first, in Mom's shaky cursive, begging me to come back and talk. The ink smeared where tears had fallen. The second, a terse, typewritten note from Dad, warning that a 30-day foreclosure notice could be construed as fraud if not remedied. And the third, Dylan's sprawling text full of blame, calling me cold and reckless for ruining Ethan's celebration. I read each one twice, then set them aside without a reply, feeling the familiar tug of guilt loosen for the first time. A fourth message arrived via Instagram DM from cousin Melissa, feigning concern with a flurry of emojis and questions about my state of mind. And an aunt I barely know left a frantic voicemail pleading for help with overdue utility bills. Even Pastor Emma called to entreat me toward forgiveness, warning that bitterness poisons the soul. Each outreach felt like a lifeline thrown only to yank me back into their chaos, but, in the silence between calls, I discovered something new, a quiet space where I could breathe without obligation, and the burgeoning realization that I didn't have to rescue them again. Determined to see what lay beyond their expectations, I booked a solo trip to Santa Fe, no explanations, just a one-way flight and a list of museums to explore. In the high desert, I traded spreadsheet alerts for Adobe sunsets, marveling at how the wind reshaped sand dunes into moments of calm. Back home, the walls of my living room filled with the aroma of homemade bread and laughter from friends I'd neglected for years. I began therapy on weekday mornings, sitting opposite a gentle-eyed counselor who helped me untangle the belief that love equals sacrifice. You carried their burdens because it felt safe, she said. Now you must learn what it means to stand unburdened. Her words echoed in my mind during an aimless drive through my old neighborhood, when I stumbled upon 123 Maplewood Drive. A U-Haul sat against the curb, movers loading the last boxes. Inside, the silent house looked abandoned, its windows dark. I slowed to a crawl, heart steady yet heavy, watched Dylan heft a flat-screen TV past the porch, and understood that the final guilt trip had already been unpacked, leaving me free to glide forward, leaving behind the structure I'd propped up for too long. Weeks later, my phone buzzed with a text from Clara Whitmore at the Round Rock Historical Society. They'd accepted Grandma's tin locket as a town artifact, a symbol of roots deeper than any mortgage. I drove out to hand it over in person, marveling that my act of letting go preserved something more precious than walls. That evening, I hosted a small rooftop taco dinner for close friends, no passive-aggressive speeches. No borrowed expectations, just good food and real laughter under string lights. As I looked around at faces that chose me for who I am, not what I paid, I felt a warmth that no family obligation had ever sparked. In the hush that followed, a notification blinked on my screen, an email from Pastor Emma, offering pride instead of reproach. I smiled and closed my eyes, realizing that true peace isn't given, it's claimed in the spaces we carve out for ourselves. And mine had finally been forged in silence. 2 months had passed since Evie Carter hosted that rooftop taco dinner, and her mornings now began not with a scramble of mortgage auto-pays, but with a quiet ritual black coffee on her balcony, the sunrise painting Austin's skyline in gentle pastels. At Nimbus Cloud, the fintech startup where she led cross-functional teams, Evie had earned a reputation for laser focus and empathy qualities she'd once sacrificed at her family's altar. And this respect translated into a promotion to director of product just days ago. Yet, even as congratulatory Slack messages poured in, her thoughts drifted back to 123 Maplewood Drive, the silent house she'd once bankrolled and then watched walk into foreclosure. Its windows shuttered against her conflicting loyalties. Now, she leaned into her new role, drafting a talk on boundary setting in the workplace, scheduled for a Women in Tech panel next month, and wondered whether her most powerful lesson would come from corporate strategy or from the halls of her own childhood home. One rainy Saturday, she found herself driving past the Round Rock Historical Society, its brick facade bright against the storm-washed street. Inside, Clara Whitmore greeted her with warm excitement, unveiling the exhibit centered on the Carter family legacy photographs of Evie's grandmother hand-quilting beneath the porch light. Her grandfather's World War II medals, displayed in a glass case, treasures she'd once overlooked in her rush to pay the bills. Clara gently placed Grandma's tin heart locket in Evie's hand, the cool steel weight affirming that some heirlooms transcended real estate. As she traced the initials, Evie felt the years of guilt ease into something like gratitude, realizing that by letting go of the house, she had preserved these memories, and that her family's story was more than a foreclosure notice pinned to a melting screen door. That evening, a text from Riley Nguyen popped up. A zoning proposal threatened another historic home 2 blocks over, slated for demolition to make way for luxury condos. Evie stared at the notification, her chest tightening with the same protective impulse that once drove her to fund her parents' mortgage. But this time, her response was different. She drafted an email to the city council, citing her grandmother's locket exhibit as precedent for preservation, CCing Clara, Natalie Brooks, and Marcus Lee for support. Hitting send felt like a declaration of new purpose, no longer a passive caretaker of family burdens, but an active steward of community heritage. As thunder rolled overhead, Evie realized that her next battle would be fought in a council chamber rather than a bank statement. A week later, standing behind the podium at City Hall, Evie addressed the council and a packed gallery of neighbors, her voice steady as she spoke of lineage, respect, and the danger of erasing collective history for profit. Natalie flanked her with legal briefs. Marcus observed the crowd's reaction, and Pastor Emma watched from the back, offering a serene nod. When the unanimous vote granted local heritage site status to the threatened house, the relief washed over Evie in gentle waves, but she recognized then that true change demanded consistent vigilance, not a one-off victory. As neighbors rushed forward to shake her hand, her phone buzzed with a new email invitation, keynote speaker at an annual FinTech conference in San Francisco, to share her journey of professional success built on the foundations of personal boundaries. That announcement set off a flurry of excitement, and for the first time, Evie embraced the duality of her life: boardrooms by day, historic preservation by night. She booked her flight, drafted her keynote from paycheck to purpose, and sketched out anecdotes that wove mortgage statements with museum plaques. Yet, in the quiet between commitments, she found herself at the threshold of 123 Maplewood Drive, once more this time not as the bearer of bills, but as a visitor invited by the bank-turned-museum curators to tour the restored parlor. Through lace-curtained windows, she glimpsed children tracing the patterns on her grandmother's quilt, couples reading exhibit placards about quilts and debts and freedom. Standing there, Evie felt a gentle thrill that the final chapter of her family's story was no longer penned in bank ledgers, but in community memory, and that the legacy she'd reclaimed was destined to outlast did any foreclosure notice. Weeks after the City Hall victory, Evie Carter found herself boarding an early flight to San Francisco, keynote slides and anxiety swirling in her carry-on. In the gleaming lobby of Moscone Center, she practiced her opening lines between sips of too-strong hotel coffee. "I'm Evie Carter, 30, Director of Product at Nimbus Cloud, and I nearly lost my home for loving too much." When her panel session began, she stepped into the spotlight, heart hammering beneath her blazer. Cameras rolled, listeners leaned forward, And as she wove her story of mortgage payments, silent hallways, and ultimate self-liberation into lessons on boundary setting, the room erupted into applause that felt as warm as a standing ovation in her family's dining room never could. Yet, even amid the cheers, as she scanned the crowd for familiar faces, she felt the tug of one unexpected gaze at the back, a quiet figure whose presence both unsettled and intrigued her. After the session, pressed by reporters and flanked by new admirers, Evie slipped away through a side door to catch her breath and found Lauren standing alone in the corridor, arms folded, eyes unreadable. Lauren's usual poise was marred by lingering doubts. Behind her, Dylan hovered awkwardly, cheeks flushed. Evie's spine stiffened with old defenses. But Lauren's voice, soft, uncharacteristic, broke the tension. "I'm sorry for what I did. I never meant to hurt you." The words carried the weight of a confession far overdue, and in that still moment, Evie realized the story she'd told the world was finally unfolding before her family's eyes. But forgiveness, she knew, could not pretend the past had never happened, and as Lauren's apology hung between them, Evie faced the choice of closing the final chapter or rewriting the next, choosing neither immediate reconciliation nor cold dismissal. Evie invited her sister and nephew to meet at the restored Maplewood Heritage House the following weekend, neutral ground for a cautious beginning. That Saturday afternoon, sunlight filtered through lace curtains onto the quilt her grandmother once stitched, and as Ethan examined the exhibit's placard, detailing Evie's role in preserving their home's history, he turned to her, voice hesitant. "I get it now." His sincerity trembled across the exhibit hall like a fragile bridge rebuilding their connection. Lauren watched, tears glistening, and when Evie gently suggested they tour the ancestral rooms together, the three of them stepped forward in unspoken solidarity, boundaries intact, but distance closing, ready to see whether a shared legacy could finally bind them without obligation. That evening back in Austin, Evie sat on her balcony overlooking the river, the tin heart locket glinting in her palm as she drafted her next keynote outline, From Family Burdens to Community Bonds. A message pinged from Natalie. "You nailed it today. Proud of you." Below that, a simple text from Pastor Emma Grace finds its way when we least expect it. Evie closed her eyes against the twilight, feeling the locket's cool weight transform into warm affirmation. In the silence that followed, she understood that the greatest revenge had not been the foreclosure, nor the viral bill payback it had been claiming her own story, piece by piece, and offering the fragments back to those who mattered most, on her own terms, and somewhere between river's quiet murmur and city lights, Evie finally felt whole.